A heavy, leather-bound folder slammed onto the polished mahogany desk, sending a shower of expensive fountain pens clattering to the marble floor. "Look at me, boy," Julian Sterling sneered, leaning forward until Elijah could smell the sharp, metallic tang of his expensive cologne. "A black mechanic with grease under his fingernails thinks he can sit in my tower and talk about property deeds? Look at your skin. Look at your clothes. You are a flatbed driver. You belong under a broken chassis, breathing in diesel fumes, not signing titles to industrial land. People of your color don't own commercial blocks in this city. You lease them from men like me until you run out of quarters." Julian let out a cold, hollow laugh, tossing a crumpled dollar bill onto Elijah's boots. "Your late father was a nobody who died, broke in one of my trucks, and you're carrying the exact same generic DNA of a loser. This tow yard is a toxic swamp. It is completely worthless, a total rat hole, just like the neighborhood that raised you. I am throwing you a bone by letting you buy it for $45,000, and you should be begging for my charity. Take this pen, sign the default waiver, and crawl back to the south side before I have the state police drag your broke ass out of my sight." Elijah Vance stood frozen, his jaw clenched so hard his teeth nearly cracked. The air in the executive suite turned to ice. Nobody dared to breathe. But Julian Sterling didn't know about the secret high-voltage grid line buried beneath that mud. He didn't know that in less than 6 months, a fleet of black Tesla corporate vehicles would descend upon that exact worthless dirt plot, looking for the young man he just called a grease monkey. Don't skip a single second of this unbelievable journey of justice. Drop your current city and your local time in the comments right now, and make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story of true resilience. The rain in Southside Chicago did not wash the grime away. It only made it slick. For 3 years, Elijah Vance had operated his small, independent repair business out of a rented, drafty single bay on 79th Street. The space was too small, the rent was predatory, and the landlord threatened eviction every time the wind blew a different direction. Yet, inside that cramped concrete box, Elijah was a magician. At 24, he possessed a rare, almost terrifying understanding of high-voltage electrical salvage. While other mechanics struggled to change a modern alternator, Elijah could dismantle a flooded hybrid battery pack, map its thermal management system, and rebuild the cell matrix using nothing but a basic multimeter and a pair of steady hands. His talent was a quiet legend among local independent truckers, but talent did not pay the skyrocketing utility bills. Every single dollar Elijah earned was instantly folded and slipped into a faded, grease-stained canvas pouch hidden beneath his late father's old heavy steel toolbox. His father, Marcus Vance, had been a master flatbed driver and mechanic for Sterling Logistics. Marcus was a man who spent 30 years keeping Julian Sterling's massive fleet running through blinding blizzards and brutal Midwestern winters. But when a faulty air brake line failed on a dangerous icy grade 3 years ago, Marcus was killed instantly. Julian Sterling's high-priced corporate attorneys swept in before the funeral fire died down, utilizing obscure, buried contract loopholes to completely deny the Vance family their insurance payout. Marcus died, broke, and his family was left with nothing but a legacy of broken promises. That was why Elijah needed his own land. He needed a fortress where no landlord or corporate tyrant could ever push his family around again. The opportunity seemed to arrive on a dry Thursday morning, when Julian Sterling himself sent a junior associate down to 79th Street with an offer. Sterling Logistics was shedding non-core, low-value assets, and they were willing to sell the abandoned 3-acre commercial tow yard at 1044 Industrial Parkway. The price was set at an exact, non-negotiable $45,000 cash. To Elijah, it felt like a miracle, a small sliver of cosmic justice. He spent 48 agonizing hours counting and recounting his life savings, gathering every single dollar bill he had hoarded, including the meager savings his mother had scraped together from her graveyard shifts as a night nurse. Elijah did not know that the entire deal was a calculated, venomous trap. Julian Sterling had sat in his glass tower on the 42nd floor, looking at a city environmental assessment report that declared 1044 Industrial Parkway a dead zone. The report claimed the soil was deeply contaminated with decades of legacy commercial fuel spills, making it completely restricted for standard municipal commercial zoning development. To clear the land legally would cost a developer hundreds of thousands of dollars in city fines and environmental remediation fees. To Sterling, the math was simple and cruel. Sell the worthless, toxic dirt plot to the dead driver's son for $45,000. Let the young black mechanic sink every penny of his savings into the property deed. Wait exactly 90 days for the city building inspectors to hit the yard with insurmountable environmental fines. Watch him default on his municipal taxes and then repossess the entire yard and all of Elijah's heavy salvage equipment for absolutely nothing. The day of the signing, Elijah sat across from Sterling in the executive suite. Before the pen even touched the paper, Sterling deliberately slid a thick, yellowed corporate folder across the polished. Elijah's eyes caught the name stamped on the tab. Marcus Vance, Internal Incident Report. Sterling leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, mocking smile cutting across his manicured face. I keep that folder around to remind myself of how my business grew, Elijah, Sterling said, his voice dripping with condescension. Your late father was a loud, stubborn man who thought his hands made him valuable. He died broke in one of my trucks because he didn't understand that true power belongs to the men who own the titles, not the men who turn the wrenches. He was a loser, and frankly, you're carrying the exact same generic DNA. I am being incredibly generous by letting a kid of your background buy this industrial lot. Consider it minority charity. But let's be completely honest. A black boy grease monkey belongs under a chassis, breathing diesel fumes, not playing real estate mogul. You'll be begging to sell this yard back to me for pocket change within 3 months. Elijah froze. The words felt like physical blows, designed to make him lose his temper, to make him storm out and abandon his dream. His sister Elena, standing quietly beside him, gripped his shoulder, her fingers tightening like steel clamps. Elijah looked down at his father's name on the folder. He felt a deep, burning anger ignite in his chest, but he did not yell. He did not slam his fists. Slowly, with hands that remained entirely steady, Elijah picked up the silver fountain pen, signed his name at the bottom of the deed, and locked his eyes onto the billionaire CEO. My father taught me how to fix things that are broken. Mr. Sterling, Elijah said softly, his voice cutting through the silent room like a razor. And he always told me that the louder a man talks, the weaker his engine really is. I'll take the yard. Sterling's smile vanished, his jaw clenching as Elijah slid the deed back across the desk. The contract was signed. The trap was sprung. As Elijah walked out of the glass tower, he could hear Sterling's assistants whispering behind his back. They believed Elijah had just purchased his own financial grave. But as the heavy glass doors closed behind them, Elijah turned to his friend Tariq, who had been quietly recording the entire exchange from the lobby entrance. Did you get everything on film, Tariq? Elijah asked, his voice completely calm. Tariq adjusted the small, high-definition camera in his hand and nodded. Every single word, brother. The internet is going to absolutely despise this man. Elijah looked out toward the gray Chicago skyline. He knew the road ahead was filled with absolute fire, but he had no idea just how high the flames would burn. Would the dead yard break him before he could discover its secrets? The gates of 1044 Industrial Parkway did not open. They groaned. When Elijah pushed against the rusted ironwork at 6 o'clock the next morning, the padlock shattered into a cloud of orange dust. The yard looked less like a business and more like a graveyard where industrial machinery went to die. 3 acres of cracked, uneven concrete pads were choked with aggressive wild weeds pushing through the fractures. Shattered glass from broken truck windshields littered the ground like frozen rain. In the center of the lot stood a dilapidated two-story corrugated steel garage, its roof sagging in the middle like an old, tired spine. To anyone else, this place was a $45,000 piece of junk. But as Elijah walked through the thick, oily mud at the eastern edge of the property, his boots hit something solid, hidden beneath a massive pile of discarded semi-truck tires. He stopped. He kicked away the rotting rubber, kneeling down into the freezing muck. Beneath the debris lay a heavy, reinforced concrete vault cap stamped with an obsolete municipal seal from 1954. Chicago Commonwealth Edison, high-voltage subsystem network. Elijah's breath hitched in his throat. He ran his fingers over the cold, unyielding iron casing. Because Julian Sterling's lazy corporate real estate surveyors relied entirely on modern satellite digital scans, they had completely missed this entry on paper. The line had been classified under an antiquated city industrial code 70 years ago and forgotten by the municipal grid managers. But Elijah understood infrastructure. He ran back to the garage, retrieved a heavy crowbar, and pried open the rusted access panel inside the building's main breaker room. What he saw made his heart hammer against his ribs. Buried behind layers of dust and cobwebs sat a massive, dormant, three-phase industrial transformer assembly. It was connected directly to an unthrottled, dedicated high-voltage substation grid line running right beneath the property. To an ordinary real estate developer looking to build luxury condos or warehouses, this legacy electrical line was a useless hazard that would cost thousands to relocate. But, to Elijah, a master electrical mechanic, it was a sleeping goldmine of pure power. The lot possessed enough direct electrical capacity to power an entire neighborhood or a massive, high-speed industrial charging matrix. "Tariq, get the camera over here right now," Elijah shouted, his voice echoing off the corrugated steel walls. Tariq sprinted into the room, holding his phone stable on a professional handheld rig. He focused the lens on the massive copper bus bars and the thick, heavy cables. "What are we looking at, man? It just looks like old, dangerous junk to me." "This isn't junk, Tariq," Elijah whispered, his hands trembling slightly with adrenaline. "This is an unthrottled three-phase line. The city grid doesn't even restrict this node because it's marked as decommissioned on their modern maps. But the juice is still live. It's sitting here, waiting. We have enough raw power in this yard to run things that people think are impossible." Elijah didn't waste a single second. He immediately went to work cleaning the dilapidated space, transforming the toxic wasteland into a functional shop. He dragged out tons of rusted scrap metal by hand, his muscles burning under the freezing Chicago wind. He set up his father's old heavy steel toolboards along the main wall, organizing every wrench, socket, and diagnostic meter with meticulous precision. He lived on cheap gas station sandwiches and drank lukewarm water from a plastic jug, sleeping less than 3 hours a night on a canvas army cot inside the drafty office. By the second week, Elijah turned his attention to the true heart of the yard's mechanical resurrection, a massive, abandoned 1,994 Peterbilt 379 heavy-duty flatbed recovery truck that Sterling had left behind because its complex electrical control system was completely fried. The vehicle's main computer module was an obsolete mess, and new parts did not exist anywhere on the commercial market. This was where Elijah decided to push the limits of his craft. He sat in the freezing cab of the truck at midnight, lit only by a single buzzing overhead fluorescent bulb. He knew he needed this vehicle operational to bring in towing revenue, but he had $0 left to buy a modern digital conversion kit. He had to bridge the truck's old analog system directly into the high-voltage electrical panel he had unlocked in the garage wall. Working with intense, breathless speed, Elijah pulled open the truck's primary distribution box. The copper wires inside were thick, stiff, and unyielding. In a moment of pure, desperate madness driven by the ticking clock of his looming property taxes, Elijah grabbed a pair of heavy, red-insulated electrical pliers. The main breaker on the wall was live, humming with a terrifying 13,200 volts of raw power. A single mistake, a fraction of an inch of slippage, and the current would instantly arc through his body, vaporizing him on the spot. "Elijah, stop, man!" Tariq yelled from behind the camera, his voice cracking with genuine terror. "Are you out of your mind? You didn't pull the main breaker on the wall. If you touch that line while the grid is hot, you're dead." "We don't have time to wait for the city to approve a power shutoff," Tariq, Elijah muttered, his teeth chattering from the cold, his face glistening with cold sweat. "Sterling's inspectors are coming in 2 weeks. If this truck isn't running, we have no business. I know exactly how this current moves. Just keep the camera rolling." Elijah gripped the red pliers, his knuckles turning completely white. He leaned into the high-voltage junction box. He did not blink. With a single, explosive, and completely insane movement, he used the red pliers to forcefully bend a thick, live copper wire, thick as a grown man's wrist, directly into the truck's main terminal block. A blinding, brilliant blue flash erupted inside the garage, casting long, violent shadows against the steel walls. The sound was like a thunderclap inside a concrete room. Tariq ducked, screaming, certain the entire building was about to explode. The air filled instantly with the sharp ozone smell of ionized electrical currents. The room fell into a dead, terrifying silence. For 3 long seconds, neither man dared to breathe. Then, a low, deep, rhythmic hum began to vibrate through the concrete floor. The dashboard lights of the massive Peterbilt truck suddenly flickered to life, glowing a brilliant, steady amber. Elijah slowly lowered the pliers, his chest heaving, a wild, victorious fire burning in his eyes. He turned the heavy iron ignition key. The massive diesel engine coughed once, spat a single cloud of black smoke, and then roared to life with a deafening, mechanical scream that shook the entire industrial park. Tariq lowered the camera, his face completely pale, his hands shaking violently. "Man, I can't even believe you just did that. You're either the greatest mechanic alive, or you're completely insane." Elijah stepped down from the cab, slapping his hand against the rumbling steel hood of the truck. "I'm just a man who knows how to listen to the machine, Tariq, and right now, this yard is finally waking up." But as the echoes of the engine bounced across the empty lot, Elijah noticed a dark, sleek sedan parked outside the perimeter fence. The headlights flickered once before the car sped away into the darkness. Julian Sterling's spies were watching, and they were about to report that the black mechanic wasn't suffocating in their trap. He was thriving. What would the billionaire do next to crush him? The report from the industrial park hit Julian Sterling's desk on Monday morning, and by Monday afternoon, the counterattack began. The billionaire CEO could not tolerate the idea of Elijah Vance succeeding. To Sterling, an independent, successful black businessman operating on land he had personally designated as a graveyard, was an insult to his corporate authority. He immediately picked up his private phone line and called the city's chief building and environmental compliance coordinator, a man whose political campaigns Sterling had quietly funded for over a decade. Within 48 hours, the weaponized onslaught of municipal bureaucracy slammed into 1044 Industrial Parkway. On a freezing Wednesday morning, 3 official city vehicles pulled into the yard, their amber lights flashing ominously against the gray steel garage. A man named Inspector Thomas stepped out, carrying a thick digital clipboard and a camera. He didn't look Elijah in the eye. He didn't shake his hand. He simply began walking the property, snapping photographs of every oil drum, every scrap piece of metal, and the vintage high-voltage electrical panels. "You're operating an illegal commercial automotive restoration and recovery facility in a restricted zone," Inspector Thomas stated coldly, his voice flat and robotic. Elijah stepped forward, his grease-stained coveralls a stark contrast to the inspector's clean winter coat. "This lot has been a registered commercial tow yard since 1968, Inspector. The deed I signed clearly states I have full grandfathered rights to operate heavy machinery here." "The rules changed this morning," Thomas replied, pasting a bright orange notice directly onto the garage door. A noise complaint was filed by a property owner 2 blocks north, a logistics firm linked to Sterling Holdings. Furthermore, you have failed to submit a modern environmental soil mitigation plan. Effective immediately, you are being assessed a legacy storage environmental fine of $12,500. You have 14 days to pay, or the city will place a structural lien on the property and freeze your commercial operational permit. Elijah froze, his stomach drop-kicking into a knot of cold fury. 12,500? That's more than the quarterly taxes on this entire block. The contamination in this soil was caused by Sterling's fleet 10 years ago. "Take it up with the municipal appeals court," Thomas said, already turning back toward his heated vehicle. "But until then, if I see this flatbed truck move out of this gate, the city will impound it immediately." The pressure didn't stop there. The next day, a structural inspector arrived, claiming the sagging roof of the steel garage constituted an imminent public safety hazard. He issued an emergency administrative order restricting Elijah from working inside the main bay after 6 o'clock in the evening, effectively cutting his working hours in half. Every single visit from the city cost valuable time. Every single citation came with an exorbitant fine designed to completely drain Elijah's remaining operational cash. His business bank account was rapidly dwindled down to its last $300. His hands trembled with sheer, unadulterated frustration as he sat at the small wooden desk in the office, surrounded by a mountain of white legal paper designed to break his spirit. But Julian Sterling wasn't satisfied with just using paperwork. He wanted to destroy Elijah's physical capability to fight back. On a brutal, pitch-black Friday night, when the temperature dropped well below zero and a blinding Chicago snowstorm blanketed the streets, Sterling hired 2 local enforcers to finish the job. Elijah had finally gone home at midnight to check on his sick mother, leaving the newly restored 1,994 Peterbilt flatbed parked securely inside the gated lot. At 2 o'clock in the morning, 2 dark figures slipped through a cut section of the perimeter chain-link fence. They carried heavy iron crowbars and canisters filled with highly abrasive industrial silicon carbide sand. With quiet, practiced malice, they smashed the side windows of the Peterbilt truck. They popped the heavy steel hood, tore off the oil filler cap, and dumped gallons of the destructive engine-killing sand directly into the truck's pristine oil reservoir. They didn't stop there. They used heavy industrial shears to completely cut NARs and slice through the brand-new, hand-routed wiring harness Elijah had risked his life to install just days prior. They punctured all 6 of the massive, expensive commercial tires, slashing the thick rubber until the truck sank heavily into the freezing mud. When Elijah arrived at 5 o'clock the next morning, the sight made the breath leave his lungs. The cabin glass was shattered across the concrete like diamonds in the snow. The massive truck, his only lifeline, his only tool for survival, was completely crippled, sitting flat on its rims in a pool of frozen oil and black slush. Elijah ran to the engine bay, pulling the oil dipstick. When he saw the gritty gray sand coating the metal, his heart shattered. The engine was completely ruined. To rebuild it again would require thousands of dollars for new pistons, bearings, and machining money he simply did not possess. Elijah quired down into the freezing, oil-slicked mud, his hands sinking into the slush. His knuckles were raw, scraped, and bleeding from weeks of brutal labor. He let out a raw, guttural cry of pure, unadulterated agony that was swallowed instantly by the roaring Chicago wind. The injustice was so thick he could taste it in the air. He was a young man who had played entirely by the rules, who had worked himself to the bone. Yet the corporate monster was still stomping on his neck, simply because of the color of his skin and the pride in his heart. Tariq arrived 20 minutes later, his camera running as he walked into the disaster area. His voice was laced with deep, heavy emotion as he looked at his broken friend, Elijah. "Man, I'm so sorry. This is dirty. This has Sterling's name written all over it. They're trying to bury you alive, brother." Elijah slowly stood up from the mud. He wiped the black grease and cold slush from his face with his forearm. His body was exhausted, his pockets were empty, and he was officially backed into the deepest corner of the wall. But as he looked at the ruined truck, a dangerous, quiet calm suddenly settled over his face. The sorrow vanished, replaced by a cold, unyielding, iron resolve. "They think they broke the machine, Tariq," Elijah said, his voice dropping to a deadly, quiet whisper that made the hairs on Tariq's arms stand up. "But they forgot that I am the one who built it. Get the tools. We're starting over." The conflict had officially reached its absolute boiling point. Elijah was completely broke, facing jail time for city fines, and his only truck was dead. How could he possibly survive the next 24 hours? The temperature inside the small, unheated garage office dropped to a brutal 12 degrees Fahrenheit as the midnight blizzard rattled the loose corrugated steel sheets above. Elijah Vance sat hunched over a battered wooden desk, his body shivering violently beneath 3 layers of grease-stained canvas jackets. The single overhead fluorescent bulb buzzed with a sick, flickering yellow light, casting long, defeated shadows across the room. On the desk lay a thick, cream-colored envelope that had been hand-delivered to his home just 3 hours ago. It was a formal, unconditional surrender demand from Sterling Logistics and Land Holdings, backed by a personal, weaponized ultimatum from Julian Sterling himself. Elijah's bank account was officially down to its last $74. The city's weaponized environmental fines now totaled $24,000, and the municipal court had already initiated a fast-track structural lien against 1044 Industrial Parkway. To make the nightmare completely unbearable, Elijah's mother, Vivian, had collapsed from sheer emotional exhaustion and stress the previous evening, her blood pressure skyrocketing to dangerous levels. She was currently lying in a cramped room at the Cook County Public Hospital. Sterling's lawyers knew this. They had calculated their timing with the cold, surgical precision of a corporate executioner. The surrender document offered Elijah a mere $2,000 to buy back the entire 3-acre property deed, a tiny fraction of the $45,000 of life savings Elijah had paid. The Tan-Yern contract stipulated that if Elijah signed immediately, Julian Sterling would use his political influence to completely dissolve the city fines and drop the pending tax fraud charges against his mother. If he refused, the city would seize the yard by Monday morning, and Vivian Vance would face a formal arrest warrant for inherited corporate tax liabilities on the property's legacy soil contamination. Elijah picked up the silver fountain pen, his fingers stiff from the biting cold, his knuckles raw and bleeding from the frozen slush. His hands trembled violently as he stared at the signature line. The pressure was suffocating. The systemic walls had closed in so tightly that he could barely draw oxygen into his lungs. For the first time in his life, Elijah felt completely and utterly broken. The world had a ceiling, a thick barrier of corrupt wealth and racial prejudice, and he had just smashed his head against it until he bled. Tariq stood in the corner of the freezing office, his high-definition camera mounted on a tripod, silently capturing the raw, agonizing defeat etched into his friend's face. The silence inside the room was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Nobody dared to breathe as Elijah slowly lowered the pen toward the paper. "Elijah," Tariq said softly, his voice cracking with deep, heavy emotion, "if you sign that paper, that monster wins everything. He takes your money, he takes your dignity, and he buries your father's memory in the dirt." "Look around you, Tariq," Elijah suddenly erupted, his voice cracking with a raw, guttural frustration that shook the fragile glass windows. "My mother is lying in a public hospital bed because she can't afford her medication. My bank account is empty. The only truck we have is filled with industrial sand and sitting flat on its rims in the mud. I don't have the money to fight a billionaire's law firm. I am just a mechanic from the South Side, and the machine has finally crushed me. Elijah dropped his head into his rough, scarred hands, his shoulders shaking as he fought back tears of pure, unadulterated helplessness. He felt a deep, piercing shame. He had promised his family a fortress, and instead, he had led them into a financial slaughterhouse. His eyes drifted down to the floor, landing on his father's old, heavy steel toolbox. The metal was scratched, dented, and covered in decades of industrial grease. Resting on top of the box was Marcus Vance's favorite vintage chrome vanadium combination wrench. Elijah reached down, his fingers wrapping around the cold, heavy metal tool. As he lifted it, he remembered the exact words his father had whispered to him on a hot July afternoon years ago, when a broken hydraulic system had snapped and nearly crushed Marcus's legs. "The machine doesn't care who you are, son. It doesn't care about the color of your skin, how much money is in your wallet, or what the man in the suit says about you. The machine only cares if you are good enough to understand its heart, and you are. Don't ever let them make you feel small." Elijah stared at the wrench for 3 long seconds. The desperate sorrow in his eyes vanished, replaced instantly by a cold, blinding, and terrifyingly sharp iron resolve. The fire that Julian Sterling thought he had extinguished ignited into a raging inferno of pure resistance. Slowly, deliberately, Elijah stood up from the desk. He grabbed the thick corporate surrender document with both hands. With a single, violent, and completely definitive motion, he ripped the legal papers straight down the middle, throwing the shredded fragments into the roaring flames of a small kerosene space heater in the corner. "Elijah!" Tariq gasped, a wild, victorious grin instantly breaking across his face as he adjusted the camera angle. "You just burned a billionaire's contract. Tell Julian Sterling that if he wants this dirt plot, he's going to have to come down here with a bulldozer and drag my dead body out of the mud himself," Elijah said, his voice dropping to a deadly, quiet whisper that vibrated with absolute authority. "I am not selling. I am not running. We are going back to work." Elijah walked out of the office and into the dark, freezing garage bay. He stood before the crippled 1994 Peterbilt truck, refusing to let the economic terrorism break his spirit. He knew the clock was ticking down to zero, and the city inspectors would return in less than 48 hours to chain the gates. He had no money, no functional vehicle, and no legal protection. He was standing on the absolute edge of a cliff. But as he picked up his tools in the dark, the smallest spark of something dangerous and unyielding began to echo through the empty lot. Would he find a way to survive the morning? The turning point did not arrive with a whisper. It arrived with a digital explosion. At 11 o'clock on Saturday night, Tariq Evans uploaded a raw, unedited 6-minute documentary video to his independent media channel. The video was titled, "A Billionaire is Destroying This 2-4-year Old Black Mechanic's Dream, but He Refuses to Quit." The footage was a masterpiece of human emotion and grit. It showed Julian Sterling's arrogant, mocking face in the glass tower, the weaponized orange city citation notices stuck to the rusted garage doors, and the devastating image of Elijah Vance kneeling in the freezing mud, his hands bleeding after his only truck had been sabotaged with industrial sand. But the true climax of the video was the scene where Elijah, shivering in the freezing office, looked at his late father's chrome wrench, ripped the corporate surrender contract in half, and swore to fight until his very last breath. The internet did not just watch the video. The internet rallied with an aggressive, protective fury. By Sunday morning, the video had reached 400,000 views. By Monday morning, as the city inspectors prepared to finalize the property seizure, the count had exploded to a staggering 3.4 million views. The comment section became a roaring digital battlefield. Tens of thousands of ordinary Americans from across the country expressed absolute outrage at Julian Sterling's corporate cruelty. "This kid is a national treasure. Those hands are blessed. The CEO is a demon. Someone get this young man a powerhouse lawyer. He didn't bend to the system. Look at his eyes. That is the face of a true warrior. Elijah did not read a single comment. He was too busy under the hood of the Peterbilt truck, using gallons of cheap diesel fuel and thousands of paper towels to manually flush every microscopic grain of silicon carbide sand out of the complex oil galleries. His body was completely exhausted, his eyes were bloodshot from a lack of sleep, and his mind was numb. But while Elijah ignored the digital noise, the corporate world was paying very close, urgent attention. At exactly 10 o'clock on a rainy Tuesday morning, the heavy iron gates of 1044 Industrial Parkway did not shake from a city inspector's vehicle. Instead, three identical, pristine, and completely silent black Tesla Model X corporate SUVs pulled slowly into the muddy gravel lot. The vehicles parked in a perfect, synchronized line directly in front of the dilapidated corrugated steel garage. The doors opened simultaneously, and four sharp, professional corporate executives in tailored charcoal suits stepped out into the pouring rain. They were led by a high-ranking woman named Sarah Jenkins, the vice president of Tesla's Global Infrastructure Procurement and Supercharger Network Expansion Division. They carried digital tablets, architectural blueprints, and high-level municipal logistical survey reports. Tariq immediately gripped his camera rig, his heart hammering against his ribs as he sprinted out of the office, keeping the lens locked on the incoming corporate delegation. "Elijah, get out here right now, man. We've got company, and they don't look like city-building inspectors." Elijah slid out from beneath the massive chassis of the Peterbilt truck on a wooden creeper, his face covered in black diesel grease, his coveralls completely soaked in sweat and rain. He stood up slowly, wiping his stained hands on a red shop rag, bracing himself for another round of legal harassment. Sarah Jenkins walked straight up to Elijah, ignoring the deep mud that threatened to ruin her expensive designer shoes. She stopped 3 feet away, her eyes scanning the young mechanic, then drifting up to the massive, historic, 3-phase industrial transformer assembly, visible through the broken window of the main breaker room. "Are you Elijah Vance?" Sarah asked, her voice clear, direct, and completely devoid of the patronizing tone Elijah had grown to despise. "I am," Elijah replied, his voice guarded, his posture firm and unyielding. "If you're here from the city to paste another citation on my door, you can line up behind the others. I'm not leaving." A sharp, professional smile broke across Sarah Jenkins' face. She extended her hand toward the grease-stained mechanic. "Mr. Vance, we are not here from the city. We are from Tesla Corporate Infrastructure. We saw the documentary video your friend posted online, and we flew in from Austin, Texas, first thing this morning. We didn't come to shut you down. We came because we have been searching for you for 6 months." Elijah froze, his shop rag slipping from his fingers as the room fell completely silent. The rain drummed heavily against the steel roof above them, but nobody dared to breathe. "Looking for me?" Elijah whispered, his mind spinning in utter confusion. Why would a multi-billion-dollar electric vehicle company be looking for a flatbed mechanic on the south side? Sarah Jenkins unrolled a massive architectural blueprint onto the hood of the Peterbilt truck, pinning the edges down with 2 heavy iron wrenches. "Because, Mr. Vance, your yard sits on the single most valuable electrical node in the entire tri-state shipping corridor. Look at this map. Tesla is currently fast-tracking our brand-new, ultra-high-capacity, Mega-Supercharger commercial fleet hub to service thousands of autonomous electric semi-trucks moving through the Midwest. To run a hub of that magnitude, we need direct, unthrottled access to a vintage 3-phase, high-voltage substation grid line. Every modern commercial plot in this city has been throttled or restricted by modern digital municipal zoning. But your yard, and only your yard, possesses a grandfathered, unrestricted legacy, 13,200-volt direct node that connects straight to the primary regional power station." Elijah's jaw went completely slack. He looked down at the blueprints, then back at the concrete vault cap hidden beneath the tires. The very asset that Julian Sterling's lazy real estate team had dismissed as a useless hazard was the exact multi-million-dollar holy grail that the world's largest electric vehicle company needed to power its futuristic empire. "We don't care about the city's minor zoning citations, Mr. Vance," Sarah Jenkins continued, her eyes locking onto Elijah with absolute seriousness. "Our legal team can dissolve those corrupt fines in an hour. What we care about is this land, and more importantly, we care about your specific recorded mastery of high-voltage electrical salvage systems. We don't just want to lease your land. We want you to run the entire regional commercial fleet maintenance facility." The tables had not just turned. The entire corporate boardroom had been flipped upside down. Elijah Vance, the kid Julian Sterling had called a worthless grease monkey, was suddenly holding the golden key to a billion-dollar industrial future. What would happen when the arrogant CEO discovered the massive fortune he had tossed into the mud? The air inside the main bay of 1044 Industrial Parkway transformed from a cold, desperate prison into a high-stakes, multi-million-dollar corporate war room within 24 hours. On Wednesday morning, Tesla's executive procurement team officially presented Elijah Vance with a formal binding infrastructure partnership contract that made his head spin. The initial terms were staggering. Tesla offered to sign a non-revocable 25-year commercial ground lease for the eastern 2 acres of the yard at an exact price of $38,000 per month. Furthermore, the company committed to investing a massive $2.4 million of direct capital to completely rebuild the dilapidated corrugated steel garage into a state-of-the-art, futuristic green energy charging oasis and high-voltage commercial vehicle maintenance hub. Most importantly, Elijah was designated as the permanent regional director of fleet salvage and maintenance, commanding an annual executive salary of $285,000, plus a full corporate equity stake in the regional charging revenue. Elijah sat at his battered wooden desk, his hands completely steady now, but his heart racing with an intense, triumphant adrenaline. Sitting directly across from him was his older sister, Elijah Vance. Elena was not just a protective sibling. She was a brilliant, top-tier civil rights and commercial contract attorney who had graduated at the top of her class at Northwestern Law. She had spent the last 48 hours analyzing every single line of Tesla's proposal, ensuring her brother's intellectual property and mechanical craft were fully protected. "The contract is completely pristine, Elijah," Elena whispered, her eyes shining with absolute pride as she tapped the digital document on her tablet. "Tesla isn't just buying the land. They are legally shielding us. Their Global Corporate Defense Council has already filed a high-level federal administrative injunction against the city of Chicago. Every single weaponized environmental fine, every corrupt noise citation, and every fraudulent zoning freeze issued by Inspector Thomas has been officially frozen pending a federal antitrust investigation into Sterling Holdings." "What about Mom's medical bills and the tax liabilities?" Elijah asked, his voice thick with deep protective concern. Elena let out a sharp, victorious laugh. "Tesla's corporate legal fund cleared Mom's entire hospital balance this morning. They transferred her to a private luxury suite at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, and the IRS has already dropped the legacy soil investigation after Tesla's environmental engineers proved that 99% of the deep chemical contamination was caused directly by Sterling Logistics' diesel fleet between 2012 and 2018. Julian Sterling didn't just walk into a trap, Elijah. He built a gallows, and his own greed just tripped the lever. At that exact moment, the deafening, frantic screech of high-performance tires tore through the quiet morning rain outside the office. A metallic silver Mercedes-Benz S-Class sedan slammed to a violent halt in the deep, water-filled potholes of the gravel lot, throwing a massive wave of dirty, black slush against the perimeter fence. The door flew open, and Julian Sterling stepped out into the pouring rain. The billionaire CEO was completely unrecognizable from the pristine, untouchable tyrant who had sat in the glass tower on the 42nd floor just days ago. His expensive silk tie was crooked. His tailored Italian suit jacket was soaked and stained with mud, and his face was completely pale, covered in a frantic, cold sweat. He had discovered the massive Tesla infrastructure deal via a leaked high-level corporate press brief just 30 minutes prior, and he realized, with a terrifying panic, that his arrogant blind spot had just cost his logistics empire its entire future. Sterling stormed through the broken roll-up door of the garage, his expensive leather shoes sinking deep into the cold muck of the shop floor. He didn't look at the rusted tools or the broken glass. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and locked entirely onto Elijah, who stood calmly beside the restored Peterbilt truck, holding a heavy iron wrench. "Elijah, we need to talk right now," Sterling screamed, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, desperate panic that echoed wildly off the steel walls. "There has been a massive, catastrophic clerical error with our original property transaction. My junior associates completely miscalculated the land boundary valuation reports. I am here to personally rectify the situation immediately." Elijah didn't move an inch. He didn't yell. He simply leaned against the heavy steel hood of his truck, crossing his arms over his chest, as Tariq silently adjusted the camera lens from the dark corner of the bay, recording every single second of the billionaire's complete public humiliation. "A clerical error, Mr. Sterling?" Elijah asked softly, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet rhythm that made Sterling's chest heave with anxiety. "Funny how your associates only notice a clerical error after Tesla's legal team files a multi-million-dollar federal injunction against your shell companies." Sterling flinched as if he had been struck across the face. He stepped closer, his hands shaking violently as he pulled a crisp, newly minted cashier's check from his leather breast pocket, holding it out toward Elijah with a trembling, desperate gesture. "I'll give you $500,000 cash right now, Elijah," Sterling begged, his voice cracking as a bead of cold sweat rolled down his forehead into his eyes. $500,000! That is more money than your entire family has earned in 3 generations. You can buy 10 houses on the south side. Just sign this rescission deed, return the property title to Sterling Holdings, and let's put this unfortunate misunderstanding behind us. Think about your mother's future." Elijah Vance stepped out from the office doorway, her arms folded, her sharp, piercing gaze locking onto the billionaire like a hawk targeting its prey. "My mother is currently resting in a private executive suite, Mr. Sterling, fully funded by the company you are currently trying to defraud. And as my client's legal counsel, I strongly advise you to put that piece of paper back in your pocket before I add a federal extortion charge to the antitrust lawsuit we filed against you at 8 o'clock this morning." Julian Sterling went completely pale, his chest heaving as his hands dropped slowly to his sides. The cashier's check slipped from his trembling fingers, falling straight into a pool of dirty, oil-slicked slush at his feet. The room fell into a dead, terrifying silence that was absolute. Nobody dared to breathe. The arrogant billionaire who had stood in his tower and called a young black mechanic a worthless grease monkey was now completely broken, frozen in the mud, staring at the face of his own financial ruin. He had played a crooked game of chess, but he had completely forgotten that the machine always records the truth. How would he survive the fallout? The metallic silver Mercedes-Benz remained idling in the muddy yard, its exhaust cutting through the freezing Chicago rain. But inside the garage, the power dynamic had completely shifted. Julian Sterling stood frozen, his eyes darting frantically between Elijah's cold, iron stare and Elena's razor-sharp smile. The cashier's check lay completely ruined in the oil-slicked slush, a useless piece of paper rapidly absorbing the black grime of the very tow yard he had deemed worthless. The silence inside the corrugated steel walls was suffocating, broken only by the steady, deep rumble of the Peterbilt truck's engine. the very engine Sterling's men had tried to destroy with industrial sand. "You don't understand what you're doing, kid," Sterling stammered, his voice dropping from a desperate plea to a low, venomous hiss. He tried to regain his footing, adjusting his soaked Italian suit jacket, though the mud clinging to his trousers made the gesture look entirely pathetic. "Tesla is a global machine. They will chew you up, spit you out, and leave you with nothing but a breach of contract lawsuit the moment their infrastructure priorities shift. I am offering you real cash. $500,000. Clean. Safe. You can walk away from this toxic dump right now and never have to look at an engine block again." Elijah slowly picked up his father's vintage chrome vanadium combination wrench from the hood of the truck. He didn't wave it like a weapon. He simply held it, feeling the solid, unyielding weight of the tool in his palm. He walked forward until he was standing just 2 feet away from the billionaire, completely unfazed by the sharp, metallic tang of Sterling's expensive cologne, which was now mixed with the sour smell of wet wool and panic. "You told me that my father was a nobody, Mr. Sterling," Elijah said, his voice dropping to a low, rhythmic cadence that resonated through the quiet bay. "You sat in your glass tower on the 42nd floor and told me that people of my color don't own commercial blocks in this city. You said we only lease them from men like you until we run out of quarters. You thought you were buying my financial grave for $45,000 because your lazy surveyors couldn't see past the rust on the fence. But my father didn't just teach me how to turn a wrench, Mr. Sterling. He taught me to listen to what's hidden beneath the surface. He knew about this high-voltage line. He knew what this yard was truly worth." "That's a lie!" Sterling shouted, his face twisting into a mask of pure rage as a frantic cold sweat poured down his neck. "Marcus Vance didn't know anything. He was a driver, a grease monkey, who died in debt to my company. He died because your logistics firm refused to maintain the air brake lines on your fleet to save a few pennies on your quarterly profit margins." Elena stepped forward, her voice cutting through Sterling's outburst like an absolute blade. She pulled up a newly unsealed federal compliance document on her digital tablet, turning the screen directly toward the billionaire's pale face. And, as of exactly 6 minutes ago, Tesla's corporate compliance division, in coordination with the Federal Trade Commission, has officially initiated a forensic audit into every single property acquisition Sterling Logistics has made along this industrial corridor over the last 10 years. "We have already unburied the text messages between your executive vice president and Inspector Thomas. We have the exact electronic paper trail proving you weaponized the city building department to force my brother into a fraudulent default." Julian Sterling froze. His chest heaved violently, his mouth opening and closing as the reality of his situation crashed down upon him. The room fell into a dead, terrifying quiet. Nobody dared to breathe. He wasn't just facing the loss of a valuable 3-acre dirt plot. He was looking at the complete, catastrophic dismantling of his entire multi-million-dollar regional logistics expansion. By attempting to crush a young black mechanic on the south side, he had inadvertently triggered a federal antitrust landslide that was about to swallow his glass tower whole. "This corridor was supposed to be mine," Sterling whispered, his knees visibly trembling as he stared at the digital court filing. "The entire terminal project. A $200 million supply chain contract with the state. It's completely contingent on owning this specific zone." "Then I guess your project is officially dead, Mr. Sterling," Elijah said, his voice completely calm, his eyes locking on to the broken CEO with absolute finality. "Because this land is no longer for sale to you at any price. You built your entire empire by stepping on the necks of men like my father, assuming we would always stay under the chassis, breathing your fumes. But the machine has a heartbeat, and right now, it's beating for us. Get out of my yard." Sterling looked up at Elijah, searching for any sign of hesitation, any fraction of greed he could exploit with more money. But he found nothing but an unbreakable wall of human dignity and iron resolve. Slowly, without uttering another single word, the billionaire turned around and walked out of the garage. His expensive leather shoes squelched pathetically in the deep mud as he dragged his soaked, ruined suit back toward his silver Mercedes-Benz. He climbed into the driver's seat, his hands shaking so violently he could barely steer, and drove away slowly into the pouring Chicago rain, leaving a trail of dirty water in his wake. Tariq lowered his camera rig, a massive, breathless grin breaking across his face. Man, I have never seen a billionaire look so small in my entire life. That was absolute poetry, Elijah. Elijah didn't celebrate. He simply walked over to his father's heavy steel toolbox, carefully placing the chrome wrench back in its designated slot. He looked out at the rainy horizon, knowing the victory was massive, but the real work was just beginning. The contracts were signed, the corporate monster was defeated. But how would Elijah transform this graveyard of rust into a beacon for the entire community? The fallout from the confrontation at 1044 Industrial Parkway hit the Chicago business world like a Category 5 hurricane on Monday morning. The raw documentary video Tariq Evans had captured, showing the arrogant Julian Sterling standing in the pouring rain, begging a 24-year-old black mechanic to take a $500,000 check while his legal empire crumbled around him, had completely shattered the internet. The footage had skyrocketed past a staggering 12 million views within 48 hours, catching the immediate attention of major national news outlets. By Wednesday afternoon, CNN and the Chicago Tribune ran massive investigative features detailing the systemic corruption behind Sterling Holdings' weaponized use of municipal building inspectors. The public outrage was immediate, fierce, and absolute. Faced with undeniable video evidence and a mountain of federal antitrust documentation compiled by Elijah Vance and Tesla's powerhouse legal team, the city council was forced to act. Inspector Thomas was formally suspended without pay pending a criminal indictment for administrative bribery and civil rights violations. The fraudulent environmental fines and zoning freezes against Elijah's yard were completely expunged from the municipal record with a public apology from the mayor's office. But the true destruction of Julian Sterling occurred within the financial markets. The state utility and logistics contract, the $200 million backbone of Sterling Holdings' future expansion, was officially canceled due to material breaches of ethical conduct and pending federal investigations. Sterling's corporate board of directors, panicked by the catastrophic public relations nightmare and a 90% drop in their stock valuation, held an emergency midnight session. By Thursday morning, Julian Sterling was formally stripped of his title as chief executive officer, forced out of the very glass tower he had used to look down on the working class. The arrogant billionaire, who had sneered that people of Elijah's color didn't belong in the room of deeds, had been utterly erased from his own creation. While the corporate tower burned, 1044 Industrial Parkway was alive with the sound of rapid, futuristic transformation. A massive fleet of heavy construction vehicles, deployed by Tesla corporate infrastructure, descended upon the 3-acre lot. But they didn't come with bulldozers to erase the history of the yard. They came with state-of-the-art engineering equipment to build Elijah's vision. The old, sagging, corrugated steel garage was systematically reinforced, its structure transformed into a breathtaking, industrial modern glass and steel architectural masterpiece. The uneven, cracked concrete pads were replaced with clean, gray epoxy-painted floors, embedded with high-efficiency thermal management loops. Along the eastern edge of the property, where the old high-voltage substation line had slept for 70 years, Tesla erected 24 ultra-high-capacity Mega-Supercharger commercial charging bays, capable of powering massive electric semi-trucks in less than 15 minutes. Amidst the million-dollar corporate upgrades, Elijah made sure the heart of the shop remained untouched. The main wall of the newly designed master bay was reserved for his father's old heavy steel toolboards, every vintage wrench and analog diagnostic meter organized exactly the way Marcus Vance had kept them. Directly above the primary workbench, Elijah hung a large, beautifully framed black and white photograph of his late father, leaning against an old commercial flatbed with a grease-stained smile and a wrench in his hand. Beneath the photo, Elijah used a bold black marker to write his father's guiding philosophy: "Every machine has a heartbeat. You just have to listen." On a warm, sunny Sunday afternoon, a sleek, private medical transport vehicle pulled into the pristine, newly paved asphalt lot of the yard. The door opened, and Vivian Vance stepped out. She looked entirely different from the exhausted, broken night nurse who had collapsed in a public hospital bed just weeks prior. Her face was radiant, her health fully restored, and her eyes filled with a deep, breathless wonder as she looked at the magnificent, bustling green energy oasis her son had built out of a toxic wasteland. Elijah walked out of the master bay to meet her, his shop shirt, a crisp, dark forest green, embroidered with the brand-new gold logo, Vance Fleet Infrastructure and Salvage. He still had a trace of grease on his forearm, a permanent badge of his craft, but his posture was that of a man who owned his future completely. Vivian stood in the center of the clean gray floor, looking up at the framed photograph of her late husband. She ran her trembling fingers along the edge of Marcus's old steel toolbox, her breath catching in her throat as a single, silent tear of pure, overwhelming joy rolled down her cheek. She didn't make a sound, but the entire room fell dead silent. Nobody dared to breathe, as Elijah gently wrapped his strong, scarred arms around his mother's shoulders. "He would have loved this room, Elijah," Vivian whispered, her voice vibrating with an intense emotional release that had been bottled up for 3 long years since her husband's passing. "He spent his entire life working in the dark so you could see the light. You didn't just save this by-exe, son. You gave your father his dignity back." Elijah squeezed his mother tightly, letting his own tears fall freely for the first time. The burning anger that had carried him through the winter blizzard had completely evaporated, replaced by a deep, satisfying sense of absolute peace. He had faced the billionaire's fire. He had endured the systemic trap, and he had proven that a pair of steady, honest hands could dismantle any corporate tower. But as the community began to gather outside the gates for the grand opening, Elijah knew his ultimate mission wasn't just about charging electric cars. It was about lifting up the next generation of dreamers who were currently trapped beneath the chassis of society. The grand opening of the Vance Fleet Infrastructure and Salvage Academy at 1044 Industrial Parkway did not feel like a corporate event. It felt like a historic neighborhood festival. The high-performance Tesla charging bays gleamed brilliantly under the crisp autumn Chicago sun, while a crowd of over 500 local residents, independent truck drivers, city council members, and international journalists packed the perimeter of the 3-acre facility. In the front row sat Sarah Jenkins and Tesla's executive delegation, alongside Elijah Vance, who was now recognized as one of the most formidable young commercial attorneys in the state. Standing directly behind Elijah on the elevated wooden stage were Jamal and Kesha, 2 19-year-old high school dropouts from the South Side, who had been heading down a dangerous path until Elijah pulled them into the yard, put a wrench in their hands, and gave them a thriving wage of $25 an hour. Today, they wore matching forest green shop shirts, their heads held high with a profound, newfound sense of professional pride and purpose. They were the very first instructors of the Vance Academy, a fully funded vocational training center designed to teach at-risk minority youth the complex fundamentals of high-voltage electrical engineering and green energy automotive restoration. Tariq Evans stood on the roof of the fully restored 1994 Peterbilt flatbed truck, his high-definition camera rig capturing the sea of smiling faces, the fluttering banners, and the massive, permanent gold sign mounted above the main bay doors. The camera caught the exact moment Elijah stepped up to the microphone. The roaring crowd fell into an immediate, respectful silence. 6 months ago, a man in a tailored suit sat in a glass tower downtown and told me that this yard was a worthless rat hole, Elijah began, his voice clear, calm, and carrying an absolute weight of authority that echoed across the entire industrial park. He told me that because of the color of my skin and the grease on my clothes, I belonged under a broken chassis, breathing in exhaust fumes, not signing deeds to property. He threw a crumpled dollar bill at my boots and told me my family carried the DNA of losers. He expected me to run out of money, run out of hope, and default on my dreams so he could steal this land for free. Elijah paused, his eyes drifting over to the corner of the lot, where a group of local kids were examining the complex cooling lines of a parked Tesla semi-truck with intense, fascinated curiosity. But what that man didn't understand is that true value doesn't belong to the people who own the glass towers, Elijah continued, his knuckles tightening slightly around the microphone. True value belongs to the people who actually know how to build, how to fix, and how to listen to the heart of the community. We didn't build this academy to escape the South Side. We built it to prove that the South Side has enough power to run the future. Phẩm giá của một con người không phụ thuộc vào địa vị xã hội hay màu da của họ. Nó nằm ở những gì họ tạo ra bằng chính đôi tay và khối óc của mình. This yard is officially open. Elijah took a heavy pair of industrial shears, looked at his mother Vivian, who gave him a proud, definitive nod, and sliced straight through the bright green ribbon. The crowd erupted into a deafening, roaring storm of cheers, applause, and car horns that shook the corrugated steel roof of the facility. The air filled with music, laughter, and the palpable, historic feeling of true systemic justice being served. Later that evening, long after the reporters had turned off their lights and the neighbors had gone home, Elijah walked through the master bay of the garage, entirely alone. The bright overhead LED panels were switched off, leaving the vast, clean gray space illuminated only by the brilliant silver moonlight pouring through the massive glass windows. He stopped at the primary workbench, running his fingers gently along the worn, familiar handle of his late father's favorite chrome wrench. He looked up at the two photographs hanging side by side on the clean concrete wall. On the left was the vintage picture of Marcus Vance, smiling through the grease of a 1980s diesel engine. On the right was a new photograph. Tariq had taken a picture of young Curtis Wells, a 17-year-old academy student who had been expelled from 2 schools for behavioral issues, but who had spent 4 hours this morning perfectly calibrating a high-voltage battery matrix without a single error. 2 generations of mechanics, separated by decades, but bound by the exact same grit, the exact same grin, and the exact same unyielding dignity. Elijah closed his eyes, leaning his back against the solid steel hood of the Peterbilt truck. The yard was quiet, the Chicago wind howling softly against the perimeter fence outside. But beneath the silence, Elijah could hear it. It wasn't the roar of a combustion engine or the high-pitched whine of an electric motor. It was the deep, rhythmic, and undeniable vibration of a 3-acre property that had been brought back from the dead, a building that had absorbed enough sweat, sacrifice, and triumph to develop its own steady, powerful pulse. A heartbeat of pure purpose. Elijah smiled, turned off the final breaker switch, and locked the heavy iron gates behind him, knowing that tomorrow morning, another machine would be waiting to wake up. This gripping journey reminds us that a person's true worth can never be measured by the size of a corporate tower, the price of a suit, or the color of their skin. True power lies in human dignity, mastery of craft, and the unyielding resilience to stand tall when the system tries to push you down. Wealth can buy land, but it can never buy the soul of a creator. If this story of absolute justice touched your heart today, please leave a comment below with your thoughts on Elijah's ultimate victory. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with someone who needs to remember that their steady hands can change the world.